The air in the car smelled faintly of pine and aging leather, the kind that clings to fabric long after the weekend is over. My husband was humming softly to a song I didn't recognize, tapping the steering wheel with a sense of rhythmic optimism. That made me feel, oddly, even lonelier. I looked out the window as we approached the countryside, trees like tired guards lining the road, their leaves curling from the late summer heat. We hadn't been to the family cabin in over a year. How? Thought it might be refreshing to unplug for a couple of days. I had agreed too quickly. There was a fatigue in our routine, a silence in our touch. But not the kind born of conflict, just flatness. He was kind, he listened, he remembered to buy my favorite tea. But he hadn't looked at me in weeks. Not really. And maybe, even more truthfully, I hadn't tried to be seen when we arrived. The porch creaked under our weight like it always had. The cabin smelled of dust, pine, and old books, familiar and unsentimental. And then he appeared. His father, or rather his stepfather, taller than I remembered, broader across the shoulders. He wore a simple t-shirt, rolled at the sleeves, revealing the kind of forearms that spoke more of labor than gym routines. His hair was more silver than last year, but his posture was firm, movements efficient. He looked like someone who had never once needed anyone's permission to exist. "Long drive?" he asked, opening the screen door with his elbow as he carried out a box of tools. "Not too bad," I replied, quickly adjusting my shirt where it had ridden up from the seatbelt. His eyes rested on mine a fraction longer than necessary. Not inappropriate, but not indifferent either. The first evening passed like 1,000 others, unpacking, slicing tomatoes, awkward small talk over dinner. My husband was cheerful, nostalgic. He poured wine. His stepfather barely spoke, only joining in when asked. But I noticed the way his gaze lingered, not hungrily, but attentively, whenever I moved, spoke, or laughed too hard at a dry joke. Later, I offered to wash the dishes. The kitchen window faced the woods, dark and endless. As I stood barefoot on the cold tile, sleeves rolled up, I felt him behind me. Not close, just present, reaching for something in a drawer. Our shoulders brushed slightly. It meant nothing, but still, I noticed. How steady my breath became? Does the plumbing still rattle when you turn on hot water? I asked, more to fill the silence than anything else. He didn't answer immediately. Only when you're too quick to switch, it needs patience. I looked up. He wasn't talking about the pipes. Or maybe he was. The ambiguity made me uncomfortable, then intrigued. Then it passed. He left the kitchen, and I finished cleaning alone. That night, my husband snored softly beside me while I lay awake. The sheets felt too crisp, the mattress too small. I stared at the ceiling, replaying that brush of a shoulder, the subtle shifts in tone. It was ridiculous, I told myself, that nothing had happened. The next morning, I got up before both of them. I wanted to shower before the hot water became inconsistent. As I stepped into the hallway, steam slipped out beneath the bathroom door. I froze. I hadn't heard anyone get up. The door creaked open. He stepped out in nothing but a towel, water glistening on his chest, his hair slicked back, skin flushed. From the heat, I was wearing only a thin camisole and shorts. Hadn't expected anyone else to be awake. For a second, neither of us moved. He nodded politely, stepped aside. "Bathroom's yours." His voice was calm, casual. "Thanks," I said too quickly. I shut the door behind me and stood against it, pulse pounding. That image stayed with me all day, not because of lust, not in the obvious way, but because of the way he carried himself, comfortably, fully, and in contrast I couldn't remember. The last time I felt seen that clearly, not admired, not flattered, just noticed. That evening, the three of us sat on the porch with drinks. My husband talked about fixing the broken shutters. His stepfather watched the trees in silence. "You've got a good woman," he said suddenly, without turning. "Just don't forget she's not furniture." I glanced up sharply. My husband laughed, a bit confused. "Of course not," he said, but I wasn't sure who the remark was truly for. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, not in what was said, but in what was quietly acknowledged. The next morning began with the sound of eggs cracking and the steady clink of utensils against cast iron. I lay still for A while, listening through the thin walls of the cabin, it was quiet, save for the occasional low voice. His, probably commenting on the stove or the eggs being too runny. My husband had gone out to check the car's suspension. He always found something to fix when we were away from the city. It made him feel useful. I got up slowly, letting my feet find the cold wooden floor, and pulled on a loose cotton dress. The straps slid a little down my shoulders, but I didn't fix them. The neckline, too, dipped lower than I normally wore around family. But I told myself it was just too early to care. In truth, I felt strange inside my own skin, awake in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He was in the kitchen, his back to me, flipping something in a pan. No towel this time. But I remembered his body clearly. Not just the shape, but the ease of it. That morning image had followed me into sleep, into the spaces between my thoughts, like a song you try not to hum but catch yourself repeating. He glanced over his shoulder when I entered. Hungry? I nodded and took a seat, pretending to scroll through something on my phone. But the screen was dark. My husband called from outside, something about needing a specific tool, and he asked me if I'd mind driving with his stepfather to the farmer's market nearby. He knows the place better, he added. You can pick out that sourdough you like, I agreed without thinking. Later I'd replay that choice. How easily I said yes. The ride was quiet at first. The road curved gently through hills and trees. The sun filtered through green leaves like watery gold. The windows were halfway down, and the wind moved my hair across my face. I didn't push it away. He didn't talk. Not until 20 minutes. And you ever wonder what it would feel like to be wanted again? His tone was level, as if asking whether I preferred white or red onions. Not liked, not loved, just desired. I didn't answer. I felt the words settle low in my stomach, like warm ash. I knew what he meant. I knew the difference. He didn't look at me when he said it, just kept driving, his fingers loose on the wheel. I stared at the dash, watching the little dust particles float through the light. At the market, everything felt too colorful. The tomatoes were too red, the peaches too fragrant. I lingered longer than necessary at the bread stall, just to breathe. When we loaded the bags into the trunk, our hands brushed. Neither of us apologized. On the way back, it happened. We were 20 minutes from the cabin when he pulled over on a gravel patch near a clearing. Brake lights loose, he said, and got out. I sat still, unsure whether to follow or wait, but then he didn't go to the back of the car. He lit a cigarette and walked a few paces toward the trees. I got out, told myself I needed air too. The forest was quiet, only the soft rustle of branches above us. He turned to me and held my gaze for a second that felt longer than anything I'd shared with my husband in months. I shouldn't have said what I said earlier, he murmured. You said what you meant, he exhaled. You're not as invisible as you think. There was no plan. No dramatic step forward. I moved closer because I wanted to. My hand found his shirt. Creased, sun-warmed. His fingers touched the side of my jaw, slow, patient, and then his mouth was on mine. Not greedy, not rushed, measured. Intentional, like he had waited years for this second and didn't want to waste a breath of it. When I pulled away, my hands were shaking. I didn't say anything. He didn't either. We got back into the car, closed our doors in near silence. The rest of the ride passed in a fog. I stared out the window, barely registering the trees. He didn't touch the radio. At the cabin, my husband greeted us at the steps, cheerful and oblivious. He kissed my cheek. I let him. My mouth still tasted like another man. While they unloaded the bags, I went to the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the closed toilet seat, breathing through my nose. My reflection in the mirror looked unfamiliar. Flushed, awake, my lips slightly swollen, and not from the wind. I didn't feel guilt. I felt alive. For the first time in years, I felt like a woman whose skin belonged to her again. Later, when we sat down to eat, I noticed how carefully I avoided looking at him, and how often he didn't avoid looking at me. My husband poured me wine, his hand brushing mine, and I smiled at him. But my body still remembered the texture of cotton under my fingertips, the smell of tobacco and pine, and in that memory, I found a part of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost. We left the market behind us. But I didn't leave what happened. There, that kiss clung to me, not just on my lips, but in how I walked, how I breathed, how I sat down and stood up. It was as though someone had adjusted the focus of my vision. Everything was suddenly too clear, too sharp. My husband's jokes grated against my ears, not because they were bad, but because I now noticed how distracted he was when I laughed. He didn't look. He didn't ask why. The cabin was warm with cooking smells and evening air by the time we returned. I stayed in the kitchen longer than I needed to, slicing cucumbers and herbs for a salad I had no appetite for. My fingers moved without thought. I was replaying. The moment he touched my jaw again, the heat in his breath, the patience in that kiss. I'd expected guilt. I found none. Instead, I felt anticipation and dread. Both were growing in me like twins, one vibrant, one diseased. Dinner that evening unfolded like any other, the three of us sitting around the small wooden table, passing dishes, asking polite questions. The walls were close, the lights too soft. My husband talked about the upcoming week, about needing to stop by the office on Monday for some overdue reports. I nodded at the right places. I passed the pepper. I sipped wine. He, on the other hand, his stepfather, was quiet, observant. Occasionally, he would interject with a dry comment or shake his head at a story. But mostly, he watched. Not just me, but both of us. He had a way of listening that made you feel like your words carried more weight than they did. It was unnerving, but also magnetic. At one point, as I reached across the table to pour myself more water, my bracelet slipped down my wrist. He reached out and adjusted it wordlessly, just a small shift with his thumb and forefinger. My husband didn't notice, but I felt the pressure of that touch long after he let go. Later that night, while my husband showered, I stepped onto the porch. The air was cooler, the night quiet in that particular way only rural places can be. Like the world had paused, I leaned against the railing and stared into the dark, trying to sort my thoughts. I wasn't naive. I knew what had begun, and more dangerously, I knew what I wanted. He joined me after a few minutes. Standing a few feet away, we didn't speak for a while. Only the creaking of the porch beneath our feet broke the silence. I shouldn't have let that happen today, I said eventually, my voice low. He looked out at the trees. You kissed. Me, I know, another pause, then without looking at me, he said, Do you regret it? I didn't answer. I didn't have to. He already knew. It wasn't a question for clarity. It was a question for memory, for permission. The next morning, the rhythm of life continued, as though we were still just family, still ordinary, but something hung in the air between us, tangible, invisible. My body became hyper-aware of his presence. I could hear his footsteps before he entered a room. I could feel his eyes before I turned around. That day, my husband announced he'd have to leave for 2 days, some last-minute work trip that couldn't be rescheduled. He seemed frustrated about it, but also oddly relieved, as if escaping from the quiet tension he hadn't yet consciously acknowledged made the decision easier. I acted disappointed, but inside, a slow fire was already building. That evening, after he packed and went to bed early, I sat alone in the living room pretending to read. The book was open on my lap, but I didn't turn a single page. I heard his stepfather moving about in the guest room down the hall, the sound of drawers, the dull thud of a cabinet door. I got up eventually, not even knowing why at first, maybe to offer him something, or maybe because I couldn't stay still anymore. As I reached the hallway, I saw him standing by the window, watching the moonlight spill across the wooden floor. He didn't turn when I entered. He'll be gone 2 nights, I said, more a statement than anything else. I know. I stepped closer. Not touching. Not yet. I don't know what I'm doing, I said quietly. His voice was calm. You're doing what you feel. I stood in that silence, 2 heartbeats away from losing myself again, but I didn't move. Neither did he. I'm not proud of what I want, I added. He turned to face me. Then be honest about it, at least with yourself. His words landed hard, not cruel, not even accusatory, just real. That night, I lay in bed next to my husband. listening to the tick of the clock and the slow shifting of his breath as he drifted to sleep. I stared at the ceiling, and all I could think about was the man across the hall, who had said less to me in 2 days than my husband had in a week, but had seen me more clearly in a single glance. I hadn't touched him again. Not yet. But I knew I would, and not because I was broken, because something inside me was waking up. He left early in the morning, before the sun had fully risen. I heard the car engine start from the bedroom, that familiar soft growl echoing in the still air around the cabin. I didn't get up to say goodbye. I stayed in bed, eyes open, waiting for silence to settle again. Only when it did, only when I knew he was gone, did I exhale fully. For the first time in hours, the house shifted with his absence. It felt larger, though not emptier. I pulled the sheet around my body and lay there a while longer, staring at the faded pattern on the ceiling. I knew I had choices. I could clean the kitchen, take a long walk through the woods, call someone I hadn't spoken to in a while, but none of those ideas reached me. I finally got out of bed, walked barefoot to the bathroom, and turned on the tap. The cold water took a moment to come. I stood in front of the mirror as I waited, taking in the shadows beneath my eyes, the slight redness in my cheeks that hadn't quite faded since yesterday. There was a tension in my reflection, something not soft, not romantic, but electric, awake, almost dangerous. I chose my clothes carefully, though I told myself it didn't matter. A linen blouse, light gray, that clung a bit at the waist and fell open just enough at the collarbone to feel like a decision. I left the second button undone. Underneath it, I wore lace. Not for support, but because I needed the feeling of it against my skin. He came late in the morning, just after I'd finished folding laundry. The knock on the door was soft, almost cautious. When I opened it, he was standing there with a small bag over his shoulder and a folded paper in his hand. "Wrench and sealant," he said. "Thought I'd finish that leaky cabinet pipe while no one's here to interrupt." I moved aside without a word. He stepped in. The energy between us had shifted again. This time, it wasn't loaded with guilt or tension. It was quieter. He moved through the house like he belonged there, like his presence no longer needed to be justified. I sat at the kitchen table while he pulled tools from his bag, his back to me as he crouched beneath the sink. The sounds of metal against metal, the occasional sharp inhale of breath, filled the air between us. I watched the muscles in his forearms tense and release as he worked. The stretch of his shirt. Across his shoulders, there was no pretense of flirtation, no deliberate glances, and yet it was the most intimate hour I'd had in years. When he stood, wiping his hands with a cloth, our eyes met. No words were spoken. I rose from my chair and stepped toward him, not with urgency, but with the calm of someone who had already accepted what was coming. I was close enough to smell the sun on his skin, to see the faint lines around his mouth. "I thought about yesterday," I said, "more than I should have." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. I didn't plan to let that happen, I added, but I haven't stopped wanting it since. His eyes dropped to my collarbone, then rose again. "I could leave." "You could," I said, "but you won't." There was no pause this time. No drawn-out hesitation. I stepped closer and placed my hand on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath. He mirrored the gesture, letting his fingers drift along the side of my arm, then down to my waist, stopping there, as if asking without asking, and then I kissed him. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't testing. It was a claim, an acknowledgement, the kind that renders apology useless. We didn't speak after, not for a while. He stayed for lunch. We sat at the same table where I'd eaten with my husband days before. I sliced bread and poured olive oil into a dish for dipping. He passed me a napkin. It could have been domestic, normal, but the space between us pulsed with something else entirely. His eyes followed the curve of my neck every time I turned. Mine lingered on the way his hand gripped the edge of the table. The sun shifted across the floor, tracing time through the wooden slats. When he rose to leave, I didn't ask him to stay. He didn't ask to return. There was an unspoken understanding now, something that lived in the in-between, a door slightly ajar. a silence full of meaning. After he left, I stood in front of the mirror again. My lipstick was smudged at one corner, my blouse slightly wrinkled. I didn't fix either. Instead, I touched my lips, gently, remembering I felt no shame, no regret, just a hunger I hadn't known how to name before. That night, I sat on the couch with my legs folded beneath me, sipping wine in the dark. The house creaked as it cooled. Every now and then, a branch brushed the window pane as if reminding me I wasn't entirely alone. My phone buzzed once. A message from my husband saying he'd arrived safely and would be busy most of the next day. I typed a quick reply and set the phone down, screen facing the table. I stared into the glass in my hand, watching the deep red swirl as I tilted it slowly, thinking not about the man I'd married, but the one who had just left, and I knew this. Wasn't over, it had only just begun. The next morning passed without direction. I moved through the cabin like someone suspended between realities. I wasn't waiting, not exactly. But I also wasn't doing anything else. The hours were thick, slow. Time didn't feel linear anymore. It folded in on itself, re-looping yesterday's kiss, his hands, the sound of him closing the door behind him. I kept catching myself touching my neck absent-mindedly, fingertips ghosting over the same line his breath had followed. The cabin was quiet. Too quiet. I let music play low from the speaker in the kitchen, something instrumental, ambient, barely there. But even that couldn't mask the shift in the atmosphere. I didn't know if he would come back. We hadn't said anything about next time, but the silence between us had said plenty. It felt unfinished, still alive. Just after noon, there was a knock on the door. Not rushed, not hesitant, just one deliberate set of 3 taps. My breath caught. When I opened the door, he stood, there again, in the same gray shirt he'd worn days before. But it looked different now. Or maybe it was me who had changed. His presence no longer surprised me. It unsettled me. Yes, but not because it was inappropriate, because it made everything else feel irrelevant. He held up a paper bag. Forgot my gloves yesterday, thought I'd stop by, brought lunch. I stepped aside, letting him in. We didn't eat right away. He placed the bag on the table, then looked around the room, eyes grazing over the things he already knew. The placement of chairs, the chipped mug drying beside the sink. Then his gaze landed on me. I wasn't wearing anything dramatic. Just soft denim shorts and a sleeveless blouse, loose, but light enough for my skin to feel the breeze from the open window. Underneath, something black, sheer. Something I chose for reasons I hadn't fully admitted, even to myself. We stood in that silence again. That familiar, too loud stillness that always came before something happened. He crossed the kitchen. Slowly. I didn't move. When he reached me, he didn't touch me right away. He just stood close enough that I could smell the peppery edge of his cologne, the trace of sawdust on his clothes. My body responded before my mind could. My breath shallowed, my spine straightened, my shoulders relaxed in anticipation. "Do you want this?" he asked. It was the only moment he ever gave me a choice. "Yes," I said. "I do." The kiss was different this time, less patient, hungrier, not rushed, but charged with everything that had been building. He pressed me gently against the edge of the counter, his hands on my waist, and I could feel the tension in his fingertips, how tightly he held back more than he gave. My own hands moved with less restraint, tracing the heat through the cotton of his shirt, finding the rhythm of his breath. The kitchen around us stayed exactly the same, the kettle on the stove, the apples in the bowl, but the air between us, twisted, curled, became something heavier. I didn't think about my husband in that moment. I didn't think about consequences or ethics or lines crossed. I thought about skin and heat and the way desire made me feel like a woman again. Not a wife, not a host, not someone else depended on, just a woman. When we pulled apart, it wasn't dramatic. There was no trembling collapse, no whispered apology. We just stood there, catching our breath. His hands didn't fall away immediately. Mine lingered near the curve of his neck, thumb tracing a line I'd never memorized but now knew by instinct. "I shouldn't be here," he said. "But you are," I replied. He didn't argue. Eventually, we sat at the table, ate in silence, between bites of bread and cheese, our legs, brushed under the table, accidental and deliberate all at once. We didn't speak of what had happened, but we didn't return to normal either. There was no pretense. He poured us each a glass of water. I handed him a napkin. His thumb grazed my wrist when he took it. Before leaving, he turned at the door. "He'll be back tomorrow?" I nodded. He hesitated, as though debating whether to say more, then simply added, "Lock the back door. The latch sticks." He left. No goodbye. I sat on the couch for a long time after. The window beside me let in light that moved slowly across the floor. My blouse still smelled like his cologne. I didn't change. I wanted the scent to stay. I wanted the memory to soak into fabric and skin, to remind me that this wasn't just some reckless moment, that it was part of something real, something that had already gone too far to name. That evening, I showered and chose the softest robe I owned, slipped into it slowly, deliberately, and stood by the mirror, studying myself. I wasn't prettier than usual. I wasn't younger, tighter, smoother, but my eyes were brighter, my jaw more defined. There was color in my face I hadn't seen in months, and I knew it wasn't from sun or makeup. It was from being wanted, desired, the kind of wanting that ignites you from the inside out, that makes your hands tremble and your thoughts blur and your voice lower without meaning to. I went to bed early, not because I was tired, but because I needed the solitude, the quiet, the space to lie on my back and retrace every detail of what had happened. I didn't close the window. I liked the way the breeze moved the curtain across. My arm, I liked the reminder that the world outside kept moving. Even as mine became increasingly fragile, tomorrow my husband would return, and I had no idea how I would look him in the eye. He came back Sunday evening, later than expected. That used to mean nothing. He was often delayed, sometimes stopping. For gas or taking a longer route to avoid traffic, I never minded. In fact, I often welcomed the quiet before his return. But this time, every minute that passed tightened something inside me. The delay stretched across my chest like a weight I couldn't name. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't even ashamed. But I was changed, and I didn't yet know how to wear that change in front of him. When his car pulled up, I stood at the kitchen window and watched him step out. He looked the same, tired, casual, his travel bag over one shoulder. He moved slowly, like someone still half in another place, and that used to make me feel safe. His predictability, his decency. Now it felt like a mirror I couldn't face fully. He entered the cabin with the same gestures as always. Keys dropped in the ceramic bowl, jacket folded over the back of the dining chair. He kissed my temple, and I let him. I didn't pull away, but I didn't lean in either. "I missed this place," he said. "Missed you." I smiled. Small. Controlled. "Did you eat?" He shook his head. I had already prepared something simple: roasted chicken, potatoes, a salad with vinaigrette he liked. The act of cooking had kept my hands busy earlier, even when my thoughts wouldn't settle. We ate in near silence. He told me bits about the trip, his meetings, a brief complaint about the hotel's cold coffee. I nodded, responded where expected, asked a few questions out of habit. My voice sounded normal, maybe too normal. It was the only armor I had when he reached across the table to touch my hand. I let him. His thumb moved in small circles against my knuckles, and I noticed how soft his skin was compared to the man who had pressed me against this same countertop days ago. There was nothing wrong with his touch. It was kind, familiar, safe, but my body didn't respond. After dinner, he offered to do the dishes. I let him. I stood in the hallway outside the bathroom, watching his silhouette as he moved through the kitchen, the man I had married, the man who loved me. And yet, there was a space between us now that he didn't know existed. A space filled with someone else's breath, someone else's hands, someone else's gaze on my throat. Later, in bed, he reached for me. It wasn't abrupt or aggressive. It was loving, gentle, the way a husband touches his wife after time apart. I turned to face him, His hand moved along my side, pausing slightly at my waist. I knew the pattern of his affection, where he would kiss first, where his fingers would pause, how he would press his forehead to mine before anything more. I knew his rhythm like I knew my own pulse. And yet, I felt detached from my own skin, present, but not anchored. As though I were watching myself from somewhere slightly above the bed, I let him kiss me. I let him explore the curve of my hip and the softness of my stomach. I let him love me the way he always had, but I didn't feel it. My body didn't respond. Not in resistance, but in absence. There was no fire, no heat rising from my chest, no ache building beneath my skin. Just movement. Just mechanics. He didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did and chose not to speak it aloud. Afterward, he pulled me close and whispered something. I think it was, "I love you." Though I couldn't swear to it, I lay beside him, his arm draped over my shoulder, and stared at the ceiling, trying to remember the last time I had felt completely inside a moment like this. Not just playing the part of a wife, but being one. In the morning, I woke early. He was still asleep, his arm flung over the pillow where I'd been. I sat on the edge of the bed, bare feet against the floor, and pressed my palms against my thighs. To stop them from trembling, I wanted to cry. Not from guilt, not from confusion, but because I didn't know what to do with the fact that I no longer felt home in my own marriage. In the bathroom, I washed my face slowly, carefully, avoiding my reflection. My skin was marked by his touch, but it felt like a memory already. Fading, I opened the cabinet and stared at the bottles lined neatly along the shelf. Lotions, perfumes, the deodorant he liked on me, the one with the soft floral scent. I reached for something else, a stronger perfume, muskier, the one I hadn't worn in over a year. The one he, his stepfather, had once paused near the doorway to comment on, without words, just a look. I sprayed it once, lightly, behind each ear. I didn't know why, or maybe I did. The rest of the day passed in quiet chores. My husband fixed the screen door. I folded laundry. We moved in parallel, like trains on tracks that no longer met. He didn't ask why I was quiet. I didn't ask. Where he'd really gone the night he texted busy. Some silences, once started, become easier to maintain than to break. That evening, after dinner, he scrolled through something on his tablet. I sat beside him, feet tucked under me, hands curled around a glass of wine. He leaned into me, resting his head lightly on my shoulder. "I'm glad we came here," he murmured. I didn't answer. I only nodded, but I was already thinking about someone else, about a message that hadn't come, about a pair of hands that hadn't touched me in days but still lived beneath my skin like a bruise. And the terrifying truth that I didn't miss my husband when he was gone, I missed him. The message came 2 days later. I hadn't expected it. Or maybe I had, but had trained myself not to look. My phone had been face down on the nightstand, its silence louder than any notification. I told myself I was focused on other things, packing, groceries, my husband's suggestion that we repaint the guest room. But every few hours, I'd find an excuse to pass by the phone and glance at it, just in case something was there. That morning, it buzzed only once, a vibration so brief it could have been dismissed as a calendar alert or a random update. But I knew. I knew before I turned it over. "I want to see you. Tomorrow." No name, no punctuation, just the sentence. He never used more than he needed, and yet the meaning behind those 6 words cracked something open inside me like a stone through glass. My pulse reacted before my thoughts did. I stared at the message, not typing anything in return. The screen dimmed, but I didn't put the phone down. Later, that day, while my husband walked to the neighboring house to ask about some tools he'd lent out last year, I slipped upstairs and opened the wardrobe. I didn't know what I was looking for. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just something that felt deliberate. Something he hadn't seen yet. My fingers brushed over familiar fabrics. Cotton, linen, a few silks I hadn't worn in seasons. I pulled out a dress I'd nearly forgotten about. It was modest enough for a warm day. Sleeveless, soft blue, with a cinched waist that made me feel slightly more aware of my shape. Underneath, I chose dark lace again. For me, not for coverage, but for sensation. I didn't tell my husband I was leaving the next morning. I made coffee, packed a small tote bag, said I was walking into town for a few things. He barely looked up from the newspaper he was folding with precise corners. Still wrapped in the morning's calm, he kissed me on the cheek out of habit. I walked to the park, a public space that rarely felt truly public. It was early, still cool in the shade. The wind carried scents of mown grass and early blossoms. There were a few people walking dogs, a mother with a stroller, an elderly man sitting on a bench as still as the pigeons that hovered near his feet. But otherwise, it was quiet. He was already there, sitting on a bench under an elm tree, one ankle resting on the opposite knee, his hands folded loosely in his lap. He looked up when I approached, but didn't smile. He never smiled unless it was necessary. That was something I'd come to respect, his ability to stay entirely within a moment without masking it. I sat beside him, not too close, but not far. We didn't speak at first. We just watched the fountain at the park's center, its water catching glints of sun in restless arcs. Then he reached over and took my hand, not eagerly, not carefully, just fully. The sensation of his skin against mine was immediate and grounding. I had forgotten what it felt like to be touched without pretense, without hesitation. My fingers curled around his. And we sat like that, quiet, invisible to the world around us, while everything continued as if nothing in it had shifted. I keep thinking I should stop this, I said after a long time. I know. I keep thinking I'll wake up and this won't feel real anymore. But it does. I turned toward him then, and our eyes met. He wasn't beautiful, not in the conventional sense, but his face held something rarer. A quiet authority, a grounded stillness. I remembered the way he moved in the kitchen, the weight of his hand at the back of my neck, the heat of his breath. I remembered how, even in silence, he left me more seen than years of conversation ever had. I needed to see you, he said finally. I didn't know what you'd say. I didn't know I'd come. But you did. We didn't kiss. Not there, not with birds overhead and children nearby. But there was a kind of intimacy in the stillness between us, heavier than touch. His thumb brushed the side of my hand once. That was enough to pull everything else back into my body. The memory, the ache, the hunger that hadn't dulled. When I stood to leave, he didn't ask when we'd see each other again. I didn't offer. That wasn't how we worked. We met in the spaces in between, in the pauses no one else noticed. I walked home slowly, letting the wind press against my skin like breath. The lace beneath my dress shifted as I moved, brushing against me with every step, a secret reminder of everything no one else could see. At the cabin, my husband was in the garden, shirt damp with sweat, pulling weeds with determination. He looked up as I approached and smiled. Find everything you needed? He asked. Yes, I replied. Everything. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to him, listening to the chirring of crickets and the occasional crack of wood cooling in the walls. He slept deeply, his arm across his stomach. Mouth slightly open in the dark, I turned on my side, facing the window. The moon was low and gold. Casting pale shadows across the floor, I reached for my phone once, just to see if he'd written again. He hadn't, but I didn't need a message to know what was waiting beneath the surface of the days ahead. Something had begun. Not the affair itself, that was already underway. But something deeper, more dangerous. I wasn't in control of it anymore. And the most terrifying part? I didn't want to be. The days that followed should have returned to normal. The groceries still needed buying, the floors still needed sweeping, and my husband, unaware of the fractures forming beneath the skin of our life together, resumed our routines with quiet confidence. He spoke to me the same way, touched me the same way, and when he smiled, it was with the unknowing warmth of someone who still believed in what we were. But for me, every moment now passed with the faint echo of a life I was living in parallel, one where time slowed, eyes lingered, and my body remembered other hands. I didn't contact him, and he didn't contact me. The silence between us wasn't cold. It was dense, charged, like the pause between thunder and the arrival of rain. I found myself moving through the days with a stillness that bordered on detachment. I cooked, I cleaned, I answered questions, I responded with nods, half smiles, small sounds of agreement. but inside I was elsewhere. When my husband stood behind me in the kitchen, resting his chin on my shoulder and wrapping his arms around my waist, my body stiffened before relaxing. Delayed, mechanical. He noticed. "You're somewhere else lately," he said. Not accusing, just observing. I swallowed. "Just tired. You sure?" I nodded, careful to keep my tone even. "Yeah, it'll pass." He kissed my shoulder through the fabric of my shirt, and I felt nothing. Not aversion, not warmth, just the weight of what was missing. Not because he was cruel, not because he had changed, but because I had. Something had peeled back inside me, and it couldn't be resealed by kindness alone. We spent that evening together on the couch, a movie playing quietly in the background, neither of us fully watching. He drifted. Off before it ended, his head tilted back against the cushion, mouth slightly open. I watched him sleep. I watched the steady rise and fall of his chest, the lines on his face that had deepened over the years. I felt the weight of history between us. Birthdays, shared vacations, forgotten arguments, the endless cycle of familiarity. And yet, I felt like a stranger in my own home, not because I didn't love him, but because I no longer recognized the shape of my desires. They had taken on a new form, quieter, darker, more intimate. That night in bed, he reached for me again. Not insistently, not out of routine, but gently, like someone offering reassurance. His hand rested on my thigh beneath the sheets, then traced slowly upward. I didn't stop him, but I didn't meet him either. My body yielded without invitation. My breath remained steady. I performed the motions as expected, but the electricity was gone. Afterward, he held me as he always did. His thumb moved along my arm, slow and absent. I closed my eyes and tried to will myself into presence, but all I could think about was the difference. How he smelled of soap and linen, while the other had smelled of cedar and sweat and something wild I couldn't name. In the morning, I dressed deliberately, not for Guy, my husband, not for anyone who might see me, but for myself. I chose a blouse that dipped low at the back, exposing the curve of my spine, and a skirt that moved when I walked. Underneath, lace again. Dark, fine, chosen not for function but sensation. It was the only part of me that still felt honest. We drove into town together that afternoon. The silence between us wasn't tense, but it wasn't comfortable either. He pointed out a few places along the way, mentioned things he wanted to fix. At the cabin before summer ended, I nodded, added the occasional comment, but my thoughts wandered. At the hardware store, while he browsed through nails and sandpaper, I stepped outside for air. The heat was dry, the kind that wrapped itself around your arms and clung. I stood beneath the awning, watching cars pass on the road, each one carrying strangers with simpler lives. I wondered what they saw when they looked at me. Just another woman, waiting for her husband, arms crossed, eyes unfocused. I didn't hear my phone buzz, but when I checked it out of habit, the message was there. Tonight I'll be near the back road turnoff, just before sunset. That was all it said, but it was enough. My pulse jumped, my fingers curled around, the phone too tightly. Back inside, I told him I'd forgotten to grab something from the small grocer 2 blocks away. He offered to go, but I shook my head quickly. "I need the walk," I said. "It's too stuffy in here." He kissed me on the cheek again before turning back to the shelves. I walked out, crossing the street without looking back. That evening, I slipped out under the pretense of a stroll. He was sanding the porch railings, humming under his breath, dust gathering on his forearms. He didn't ask where I was going. I didn't offer. We were both learning the quiet rules of avoidance, even if he didn't know it yet. I walked down the dirt path toward the back road, every step sharpening the tension inside me. The trees rustled gently above, casting long shadows across the gravel. My feet knew the way even if my conscience didn't. And there he was, leaning against the hood of a car I hadn't seen before, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. When he saw me, he didn't move at first. He waited, always made me. Come to him, I stopped a foot away. My breath shallow, my heart louder than it had been in days. Neither of us spoke. He reached for my hand. And just like that, I was whole again. Not good, not right, but undeniably alive. We didn't speak during the drive. The windows were down, the wind warm and dry as it threaded through my hair and whispered across my skin. He didn't ask if I was sure. He didn't need to. My presence in his passenger seat said enough. The cabin disappeared behind us as the trees thinned and the road bent toward town, then away again, curling into quieter places where no one passed unless they meant to. The sun was low by the time we stopped. A field, empty and flat, stretching into the dusk, a forgotten slice of land fenced by rusted wire and overgrown wild grass. I had never been here before, yet something about it felt inevitable. Like this was the place we had been moving toward all along, even before we met. He stepped out first and leaned back against the car, arms crossed loosely over his chest, one boot pressed to the bumper. I stayed seated for a moment longer, hands resting on my thighs, as if gathering myself. But the truth was, I'd already left pieces of myself behind. I wasn't whole, and I didn't want to be. When I joined him, he looked at me like he always did, not with hunger, not even with certainty, but with recognition, like someone who saw beneath whatever performance I carried and understood the rawness under it. The woman who wanted, despite everything, or maybe because of it, the sky was turning gold, then amber, the light catching on the strands of my hair as the wind lifted them off my shoulders. I didn't reach to fix them. I wanted to feel undone. His hand grazed mine. The contact was brief but precise. He didn't hold me. He never did. Not right. Away, but the space between our bodies closed with every breath. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said. I looked at him fully then, not blinking. "For how long?" "I don't know. Maybe for good." It should have struck me like a slap, but instead, I felt a kind of stillness settle behind my ribs. The end had always been coming. It was never a question of if, only when, and now the answer had arrived. Like a whisper across an open field, I didn't ask him to stay. I didn't ask what this meant. Words were no longer the currency we dealt in. What mattered now was presence, skin, heat. That impossible ache that bloomed in the hollows of my chest whenever he stepped too close. He looked at me for a long time. "Do you want me to go?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. My voice wasn't ready. My body was. My mouth remembered the taste of him even before it moved. "I want," I said finally, "but I won't ask." That was the only truth I had left. He stepped forward and touched my cheek, just once, his thumb dragging gently along the bone beneath my eye like he was memorizing the shape of loss. And then he leaned in, not fast, not urgent, just close enough for our foreheads to meet. My hands found his shoulders, the curve of muscle there familiar now, like something I had once owned. We didn't kiss, we didn't need to. We stayed like that until the wind cooled and the sky shifted toward night, until the space between us became too heavy to hold in silence. Then he pulled away, not harshly, not even reluctantly, and walked around to the driver's side. I followed. He dropped me off 3 blocks from the cabin. I didn't ask why. I understood. As I stepped out of the car, he didn't watch me go. He turned the engine and drove off, before I even reached the sidewalk, and still, I didn't look back. The cabin was dark when I returned. My husband had left the porch light off, which meant he wasn't waiting up. I let myself in quietly, the floorboards creaking with that same familiar song beneath my weight. In the kitchen, I poured a glass of water and stood at the sink, watching the black square of the window. My reflection was there, soft, half-formed, fractured by glass. Upstairs, the bed was untouched on one side. He must have fallen asleep on the couch again. Something he did when his back ached, or when he thought I needed space. I undressed slowly, folding each piece of clothing with care before slipping beneath the sheets. The scent of the field clung. To me, the dry grass, the dust, and something faintly metallic. I didn't close my eyes for a long time. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the patterns I knew by heart. My body still held the imprint of his hands, even if he hadn't touched me that night. In the morning, the silence was different. Not strained, not heavy, just certain. We moved around each other in the kitchen like strangers sharing the same air. He poured coffee, I toasted bread. We asked each other what we needed, passed butter. and Jam made eye contact that lasted just long enough to feel familiar, but not long enough to feel safe. He looked up at one point, his fingers resting on the edge of his mug. "You okay?" The question was too simple for the answer it required. "Yes," I said. "Are you?" He didn't reply. He didn't need to. Somewhere in the space between the clink of silverware and the ticking of the wall clock, we both understood. He knew. Maybe not the details, not the timeline, but he felt the absence in my presence, the shift in my breath, the distance in my touch. And I knew that he knew, but neither of us said it, because sometimes the silence is kinder than the truth. Sometimes, it's the only thing that lets you keep breathing. We cleared the plates in silence, and the day moved forward, just like all the others, but nothing in it would ever be the same again.